Intro 1, intro 1. Intro 1, intro 1. Intro 1.
So, maybe we can start off the episode by an admonition, a autobiographical note.
No, admission, not admonition. Unless you want to admonish us. Yeah. Jake.
It's
Jake,
a bit of an
fuck
admonishment.
Or an admonition, maybe in French. You know how
We're
they
just
say
joking
in
that
French?
Jake sometimes throws in arbitrary French words to for embellishment,
For heightening.
and we were
yeah.
admonishing him for that.
Very good, very good.
But yeah, Will and I, we used to be Buddhist, and so this episode we've been kind of excited to come to it because it's like, well, on the one hand, it's one of the more interesting things, like kind of like novel things that Zizek talks about. But also I just feel like I gotta get it out, you know, get air out the past.
Exercise that demon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly enough, like the hysterical admission has been like, we're not expert from the beginning, but I feel like this is the only episode where like, do we claim some sort of expertise? And when I say we, I mean
you know,
guys.
at a certain point in my life, I was definitely much more up to speed. I could have recited, you know, the Four Noble Truths and the five skandhas and et cetera, et cetera. I lived in a Buddhist retreat center for 3.5 months. Peter and I traveled to India, and a lot of the motivation behind the trip was, you know, to visit monasteries and just sort of get a sense of the Buddhist
Religious
culture there,
sites.
religious sites. Yeah. And then, really, it was philosophy that killed my faith, and you know, thank God for that.
In a very real sense. Like,
Yeah.
I read Genealogy of Morals by Nietzsche, and it started off this process. It wasn't like lightning striking, like all at once, but it was very much the beginning of the process of no longer being Buddhist. And at this point, I very much do not consider myself Buddhist, but occasionally can tap into that former mindset. And I feel like we can do that a bit for this conversation to maybe give, you know, both sides of the story.
Okay, not just Nietzsche, but it was the slave morality, the concept of slave morality that was like really galvanizing.
That's what really got me from Genealogy of Morals.
Yeah, which is to say, ultimately, that Nietzsche's perspective on metaphysics, especially in that book, was galvanizing. And I think, you know, we can get into that later, but
Yeah, and it runs a bit contrary to, I feel like, what is a prevalent theme on the left of not so, I mean, on the one hand, there's the dominant theme of being anti-religious, and I wouldn't say that's my perspective at all, but there is a kind of growing appreciation or feeling of some sort of like spiritual need for many leftists who are kind of coming to Buddhism, and Buddhism has, not even for just leftists, but it has a real aura for people. People like, they don't know a whole lot about it, but it seems interesting. You know, the Dalai Lama's smiling, and
there's a real wholesomeness to it. You know?
Yeah,
it's
positive
it's
vibes.
like eating
coming from
organic
Buddhism.
food. You know,
but exactly. But Buddhism is a perfect supplement for spirituality for people, especially in the West. Like, when growing up in a pretty much Judeo-Christian society, at least in terms of its laws and ethics, Buddhism has been this like fascinating other religion of the other that you don't have to prescribe to in the same way that like hardcore Buddhists do in order to like speak about the tenets of it. You know, you can meditate. Like, it has become synonymous with spirituality in the West when and it's become kind of more divorced from its more religious practices.
well, they go so far as to say that it's not a religion, right?
Right, which is fucking bullshit.
It's very silly, especially when you look at the way it's practiced in Thailand or Tibet. There is an anti-theistic stance in Buddhism, and at its inception, but the way that its history has evolved throughout Asia and the West, as I said, especially in Thailand and Tibet and other Asian countries, is that it very much takes on the character of a religion with like almost very clear similarities to gods and angels and afterlife, and it definitely has a religious element to it.
And a morality too, an ethic. Yeah.
Right. And I think we should be deeply suspicious of the I think that like the rapid pop culture of like co-opting of spirituality as something that like is for everybody, like now we can all be spiritual, and that there's a necessity for spirituality in the era of neoliberalism, and aggressive capitalism. Can you guys hear me? I can't.
Yeah.
You.
Oh,
I mean, I can't hear myself think when you're talking, but it's like I can hear you.
Well, the point was certainly made, and I think we're going to talk about this later. But you see a real example of that kind of westernization of Buddhism in things like mindfulness. But I think we'll come around to that later.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to discussing that element of it. But I think
putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, I think our conversation can kind of boil down into three distinct parts here. I think first we can talk about Zizek's kind of imminent critique of Buddhism, like what he thinks some of its at least apparent contradictions are and tensions. And then we can move to what Zizek says about Buddhism and science, and what many Buddhists, including the Dalai Lama, say about science, and then kind of arrive at how Zizek understands Buddhism in relation to capitalism in general.
Sounds good.
Let's get it. It's gonna get heated.
Well, seeing as how we all like kind of agree with each other, it might not get heated, but maybe I can tap into the very kind of like evangelist Buddhist side of me. So maybe we can just kind of bounce around maybe just a simple description of Buddhism before we get into the critique. I'm sure everyone has like some basic sense of what it is, but I actually found that Zizek we read a bit of Event, the book, Zizek's book, where he has a chapter called Buddhism Naturalized, and he offers actually quite a good, succinct description of Buddhism in that book, I found.
Yes, yeah, because previously I've been like, wait a minute, Zizek, do you actually know anything about Buddhism, when he's critiquing it? But in this book, it actually seems like he has some pretty foundational knowledge about it.
And it's the kind of thing that if you know something about, like if you're a Buddhist and you're reading what Zizek or anyone says about Buddhism who's not a Buddhist, you're going to have a kind of religious reaction to it,
Totally.
Like
totally.
They haven't read this text, they don't know about these teachings, etc.
Yeah.
I was thinking about some of the people that we know back in who would
Back
scoff.
in Bleep.
Back in Bleep and bleep, but they would scoff at Zizek's interpretation of it. But I think it only serves the purpose of introducing it as something to critique. Zizek is definitely not claiming to be an expert, but it's
whenever you're gonna have a disagreement over a given subject, you have to agree at least on a few like presuppositions. And I find a lot of the time when I'm trying to discuss these issues with other Buddhists, there's a lot of resistance to even agreeing on like a type of terminology. But simply, maybe we can start by saying that I would say the primary kind of objective in Buddhism is the alleviation of suffering and the path to enlightenment. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, well, I think the actual first insight is the first noble truth, which is the truth of suffering, which is just basically the admission that suffering is our fundamental condition as human beings and the condition of all living beings.
Yeah, everything we experience, even happiness, is suffering because our experience always changes, and changes for eventually, in some ways, the worse, because everything that we have in terms of our experience and our possessions, they fade away, they decompose, we lose them, and that loss is suffering, and it's inherently born out of our desire.
Yeah, and this. Sorry, go ahead, Jake.
No, I was gonna ask if that suffering on this level becomes a kind of temporal, like an ontotemporal, like is this an ontological and temporal sort of understanding, like that because we're bound to time and to temporality and to impermanence, that suffering is conditional, right? Is that?
I think it's unconditional, actually.
Yeah, they say the first noble truth is life is suffering.
Okay.
It is suffering.
And the Buddhist word for our existential existence is samsara, which basically means the endless cycle of birth and death and suffering.
Yeah.
And as Peter was saying before, the kind of end game of Buddhism, even though various Buddhist traditions interpret this differently, is enlightenment, which is what the Buddha achieved, which is the cessation or the breaking with suffering.
Now, which is to say, you can actually interrupt. You can interrupt that chain of samsara. Like, can you be outside of it?
Yeah. Well, this we'll get to that, but I would say the first issue that Zizek has with this edifice is exactly that. It's suffering, right? Suffering born out of our desire, and desire clearly has a very different kind of inflection for him through psychoanalysis, in that we can desire suffering, in that we can enjoy our suffering. Would you say?
Exactly. And one of his examples of this is love, right? I mean, what is love if not, various, like passing through suffering and dealing with suffering. And I mean, the fall of love is for Zizek exactly that. It's a kind of like, it's subjective destitution, right?
Yeah, he has this sorry, Jake. He has this example in this lecture I was just listening to of the film noir. The femme fatale has doomed our hero in the end, and then when asked if he would change things, give it all up, no, he would do it all over again because the love was worth it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So, like, retroactively electing and making necessary suffering, right? Like that it becomes the thing that, even if suffering is not necessarily contingent, but a natural part of, our existence in the symbolic order, it's something that we can enjoy and elect and take up, right? And make necessary, right?
Yeah. The operative stance there being not so much that life is suffering, but that our kind of basic stance towards the world is one of enjoyment and desire.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not so much like, it's kind of difficult to parse out, but like in Buddhism, the desire is doomed and ultimately to be done away with through the process of becoming enlightened.
Yeah.
Whereas in psychoanalysis, there's no absent state of desire. You can't step outside of that.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, it's important that I don't think that what's being parsed out here is just a shift in perspective, which I think sometimes Buddhism can be guilty of, which is like, well, once you see that all of these things, these fluctuations in emotions are just responsive and impermanent, and that, both, hope and fear are essentially the same thing, happiness and sadness, these are all sort of intransient, they're impermanent but transient things. Just shift your perspective on reality,
mm-hmm.
on the fact that reality is fundamentally a condition of suffering. Just shift your perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily just that, right? It's that, can reality change through Buddhism? Or is it just a perspective on reality?
Totally. So what you're pointing to is, I think, Zizek's most insightful critique of Buddhism, in that we're told two very distinct things in terms of Buddhist enlightenment and proper engagement with the world. On the one hand, we're told that the process of Buddhists of being a Buddhist in the world is right action and speech. It's a proper alignment to the world, so that rather than trying to change things outside of you, you change your perspective on them, and that change of perspective is the crucial turning point in your desire and attachment to the world. On the other hand, there's something called a bodhisattva in Buddhism, where it's a kind of advanced state of Buddhist practice where the bodhisattva vows to never become enlightened until they have brought every other being in the world to enlightenment as well. So on that side, it's a kind of radical exterior maximal approach to changing the world. So we're caught between the extremely minimal, it's all about your relationship to the world, and the extremely maximal, you're fundamentally changing the entire external world.
Right.
Yeah. Well, actually, here's a quote from. I think I got it out of Disparities from a footnote. But he refers to this as a pragmatic contradiction in the very heart of Buddhism, which is often noted by its critics. Buddhism targets the overcoming of the self, but the form of its practice, meditation, self-probing with the goal of personal deliverance, is focused on the self. What Western thought opposed to this self-preoccupation is a practical self-obliteration, the engagement in a third thing for a higher cause which transcends me and with regard to which I ultimately don't matter. So that's, I think, a real distinction that like not only the tension within what you were just referring to within Buddhism itself, but the kind of essential difference to the Western frame of thinking. And something that was very interesting growing up in Buddhism was the sort of view of the Western tradition, in the sense that the stance that it took was generally that it's because it doesn't hold the truths of Buddhism to be self-evident, it so to speak, it takes the phenomenal world and rational thinking or intellectualism in general to be the kind of like primary realm of thinking and of action, whereas Buddhism thinks of those things almost as secondary, that or as illusory, and that
confusion.
Yeah, exactly. As confusion is the translated word that Western Buddhists use for it. But I think that what Zizek is referring to here, that in the Western tradition, there really is there's a different alignment with both like the notion of the self in relation to the world and the self in relation to itself. And I think maybe that's something that we can get into, the kind of philosophical difference there.
Yeah. So to that point,
by the way, did that make sense?
No, I think that makes total sense. And I think there's, in some sense, a real translation issue. We have words that kind of cross over. For example, an interesting one is materialism, right? Buddhism understands materialism as a fundamentally flawed outlook on the world, and that is very, kind of the main mode of critique that Buddhism has on the West and in general, is that our suffering is derived out of our desire for materials, right? Like we hold on and we grasp, we hold on for the kind of solidity that material gives us. Whereas, I mean, obviously materialism means something radically different in the Marxist view of the world, in that, well, I mean, we don't really have to get into that, but that's just an example of the very different way that those terms are meant. But another thing that I wanted to point to that you were saying was that oh fuck, hold on 1 second. Oh man, I forgot it.
The difference between self and relation to self, relation to reality, to the world.
Yeah. Well, Jake, do you want to say that? Then I can kind of chime in again.
No, that's just where that's where I thought that there was a really interesting point there. The philosophical difference, potentially the philosophical difference between a self relation and relation to.
Well, in the Buddhist sense, the self is ultimately an illusion. There is no self.
Mm-hmm.
And this I think someone could attempt, and I think there have been many attempts, but one might be prone to think of the Hegelian system as somewhat similar to Buddhism. But I was thinking about this yesterday, in that in Buddhism there is contradiction, and there is negativity. But what's crucially different is that in the Hegelian system, the contradiction is absolute, right? Whereas in Buddhism, the self is in contradiction with the kind of universal or whole, but the self is an illusion, and what is really kind of real in Buddhism is the whole, is being, is what they call Buddha
Right.
nature.
That's a great way of putting it. I guess you could say it's a relative contradiction as opposed to an absolute contradiction.
Yeah, exactly.
I know that some of the Buddhist literature that I've read, which I don't know if I'd call it literature, and I don't know if I'd call it Buddhist, but I basically read one person, and that's Pema Chodron, and she's the sort of I mean, I've enjoyed reading her, but I know in reading her that it's this sort of very marketable, sort of diluted Western version of Buddhism for people like me. But she does mention, the inherent tension of contradiction and the necessity to accept contradiction, but that there seems to be a liquidation of the tension actually once you acknowledge that they exist, that it exists between something like, just like she often sets up emotional contradictions, hope, fear,
Well,
stuff
yeah,
like, stuff like that.
Those contradictions are suffering, and the suffering is kind of like, insofar as you can experience your suffering, that's what your self is, which ultimately is itself an illusion, right? So it's like, it's not the contradiction there is more in the experiential illusion rather than in the rather than reality itself.
Well, exactly, and I was going to say that it doesn't set up it's not a dialectic between the contradictions. It's
No.
not the.
Yep,
it's not
exactly.
it's not. It's an acceptance and not an overcoming, or working through. It's an acceptance of the two basically being the same, right? Is that the contradiction actually, there is no inherent tension. Both sides of the contradiction are ultimately the same thing, because they are egoic and reactive and illusory.
Exactly.
And obscure and essentially obscuring.
And in Zizek's kind of edifice,
But wait, can I just say one thing quickly there?
Yeah.
Is that in these terms, I think you could say that the Buddhist notion of contradiction, as Jake, you were just saying, is illusory and experienced as an ego, and then which passing through the ego is therefore illusory. But in Hegelian terms, I think that is what kind of being is what Buddhism would term illusory.
yeah,
right?
yeah. So I was gonna
Exactly.
I'll add to that, like in Zizek's, Zizek's philosophy and Hegel's philosophy as well. We can maybe Zizek is a word for it, but yeah, the illusion. There's no outside of the illusion, right? Like the illusion, the ideology, the symbolic language is what reality is.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe in Lacanian terms, but like the as we said before, like the fetish of a meta language.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny because you're talking about Zizek and Hegel, but it's like, I think it's necessary to mention Lacan, because one of those other problems of translation is ego. And obviously in psychoanalysis, there's a huge turn on ego, but also same in Buddhism. And they're actually, I think, from the initial, they're pretty similar understandings of what the ego is, which is ultimately illusory, but the attitude towards illusion is different. And actually both, I think, would still say that there's a necessity to illusion, right? Or rather that illusion is the foundational or the fundamental,
right? But there's a
condition.
gridlock in the psychoanalytical version, whereas in Buddhism, the ultimate realization of enlightenment is that there is no illusion. That the illusion is merely the reaction that we have to the truth, and that the overcoming of that illusion is the attainment of enlightenment. Again, there's a variety of descriptions of that, but that's definitely a prevalent one.
But that's why the point of the meta language is actually quite pertinent, is because enlightenment actually does assume that, at least on the path to enlightenment, then enlightenment itself there is a meta language, that you can in fact not just assume the fact of the illusion, but then at a certain point exit the illusion. And whereas from a Hegelian and even a Lacanian perspective, it's that the absolute only appears in the illusion, only, regardless of how sort of obscured or insubstantial it is, it only appears in substantial reality, in the failed reality, in the illusory reality.
Because it's operative. And it's operative.
Right, it's operative, and it transpires only in the material of the symbolic realm. You cannot dwell in the realm of the real, which is to say, you can't be enlightened, at least from the perspective of Zizek, but that it's only through the realm of the illusion that we can, touch and encounter and for the most part be fucked up by the illusion of the real.
Yeah, I think that
that's just like, I think, a really important point that maybe we can discuss later.
I think you underlined it perfectly. And there's one final thing I think that we can touch on that Zizek says about Buddhism, that then we can kind of move on from this specific discussion. But the other element that Zizek points to is that there's the Buddhism for the layperson, in which it's basically an ethical stance to the world, right speech and right action, how you should live your life in relation to Buddhist principles. And in fact, that's mainly what is required for being a Buddhist in much of Asia. It's not so much meditation as we would necessarily think of it here. Very few people actually have a kind of meditation practice, so much as just living your life in relation to the kind of precepts of Buddhism. So there's that, and then there's also the kind of theoretical enlightened master, the detached, knowing, enlightened relation to the world, doesn't have anything to do with goodness in that kind of right speech and action sense, because there isn't a necessary link between the two. It's not as if right speech and action necessarily leads you to enlightenment. In fact, it's kind of, in some cases, claimed that it's not. Actually, it has nothing to do with enlightenment. It's just a kind of more ideal stance towards the world. And in that case, an enlightened master doesn't need to be good. They're still enlightened, in that what we would kind of regularly understand as a moral and ethical action can be completely torn up and radically opposed and reworked in the enlightened perspective, so that there's such thing as an enlightened relationship towards war and killing. Zizek's example is Suzuki, who's a Zen Japanese master, really big for the hippies. He wrote in the 30s about, kind of effectively in support of Japanese imperialist war, but a kind of enlightened relationship towards battle, wherein your movements of your sword and your gun are a kind of removal from the flow phenomena. You're detached from this material existence. Your cut, your killing is the manifestation of the other person's karma, right? You can remove yourself from worldly action so that you can do utmost acts of evil, and it would still be an act of enlightenment.
Yep.
Right. Well, it feels like enlightenment, like that second part of the dualism that you made, that you just sort of put forth, is like that second part, the enlightened person. It's like once they've recognized the status of desire and the status of reality is fundamentally suffering, it's good or bad action, it's beyond good and evil.
Yeah, because exactly. Because
just,
good and bad are evident to us only in our confusion and in our illusion. So from the enlightened perspective, those are just kind of mores or something. They're happenstantial. They're not essentially true, and they have nothing to do with goodness, like you're saying, Peter.
Yeah, because exactly.
Well, this is like if Buddhism is a response to the problem of desire, which is to say the fundamental lacking and negativity of the subject. And if it's a response to it insofar as it tries to do away with it, then I think we get into a conversation of eschewing existential responsibility, which is something that we brought up in the conversation about singularity, which is like, is there such thing as existence or of existing without subjectivity and without the tarrying of the negative, without the problem of desire? Can we just sort of exist in a state in which there is no good or bad, there is no responsibility, and so that you can either act in the world with impunity, or you've just completely detached yourself from it in this kind of like
right. And how would that
metaphysical turn?
Exactly. And how does that not appear religious, right? How does that not appear an almost godlike state? Like that's a description of God. Like not maybe but like that's a version of God, I think. So I think it's very understandable that whether or not it's to the letter of Buddhism in the traditional sense, there is a religious adoration of that state, to the point where the Dalai Lama is revered basically as a god. Actually, as a side note, I was once in an airport and I saw a large security guard walk by me, and I looked around for who they were protecting, and I look over and the Dalai Lama is kind of waddling past me.
The man waddles. Okay,
yeah,
waddles.
It's like in the middle of the night in some obscure airport. There was no one else around, and I said Tashi Delek, which is a Tibetan greeting, and he looks at me and he goes, Tashi Delek, and he waved at me. That was it. It was kind of an amazing moment, actually. But maybe in relation to the Dalai Lama, I can bring up quite a telling quote from him that might direct us towards a kind of more scientific element of our discussion. The Dalai Lama wrote, if science ever disproves Buddhism, Buddhism must change. He has a long and extensive history of like trying to make Buddhism scientific, and I'm sure people have seen a lot of this. There's all these like science magazines with like a brain. It's like how meditation I
cured my cancer. I cured my cancer with meditation.
Yeah, the image of the monk with he's hooked up the brain nodes on his skull. Yeah,
happiest man in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's like a real desire both on Buddhism's part, as we see in the Dalai Lama, to make it scientific, in that they want to quote unquote prove Buddhism scientifically, in which case the proof that science bestows is more kind of fundamental and authentic than Buddhism itself, needing an exterior proof.
Excellent point. Excellent point.
Which I think belies the basic stance that we in the West, at least, have towards science as like the objective status of truth.
The hegemonic.
Well, it's because both Buddhism and science are like, or at least science purports to be asubjective, right? It doesn't entail a subjective position, and I think that it's telling that the Dalai Lama grabs onto that, because for Buddhism, as we've been saying, the self is an illusion. So
right, and science says that too, and that's where the crossover lies.
There wouldn't be necessarily a skepticism towards an objective scientific claim on the merit or on the basis of subjectivity.
Excellent point. It's like it's barring. It's like this is not just about faith or belief any longer, right?
Right.
We might be able to objectively prove something about it.
And so, like, just to finish my thought, so Buddhism gets quote unquote proof out of its connection with science, and science gets something else as well. Like maybe it attains a kind of more ought for its is, right? Like, whereas Buddhism is science is a bit of a standstill in relation to like ethics and like stance towards the world in terms of like right action, etc. But Buddhism can maybe provide that, but with science kind of ventriloquizing it, stripping away its more kind of traditional religious elements and reducing it to the idea that the self is a kind of user's illusion of brainwaves and of, you know, electricity firing off in your neurons.
It's a mutual proof.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they're joined by the blind spot, I think, almost, or the gap.
But like what?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is like what gets smuggled in here, right? Like if Buddhism, if Buddhism must change if science disproves it, like what are we getting when Buddhism becomes scientific, right? We're getting you know, a strangely contrary to Buddhism, the Buddhist standpoint, a materialist version of Buddhism, right? Like
Yeah.
Well, okay, exactly.
Very nice.
Yeah, we're getting like if Buddhism is just like ways of your brain firing off in happier ways according to some computer reading, then enlightenment becomes part of brain function, right? It becomes merely an operation of the brain, which completely belies and contradicts the entire Buddhist religious practice.
It's how can it be mobilized, and then how can it be commodified and sold and marketed? But it's also like it's like, once again, Will, I think you just said this. It's about how can we figure out a way to elide subjectivity. It's like if we can make subjectivity just about brain neurons and and electricity in some piece of meat inside of our skull, just the same that we can make Buddhism the same, you know, and not something of faith and belief and of a religion, but something that is like measurably a good practice for our brain and our happiness and our ability to sort of accommodate the pressures of capitalism. It's like if we can basically make this just about the piece of meat in our skull, then we can do away with the problem of subjectivity, which ultimately I think both founds and transcends those, you know, Buddhism and science.
Very
right?
much so.
It's the
Well, and
fundamental gap.
ironically, like, you know, science is an empirical discipline, and Buddhism is supposed to have an absolute skepticism with regard to the senses.
Oh man, great
sensory
point.
pleasures.
Very good point.
Boom,
Yeah.
fucking boom.
And yeah,
yeah.
So Zizek asks if Buddhism is to be, or sorry, if enlightenment and happiness are to be understood via, you know, lighting up on a computer screen in relation to your brain, then can a chemical means of lighting up those very same areas achieve Buddhist enlightenment? Right? If you're reducing enlightenment to the brain, and if you can have some other exterior means of creating those very same electrical, you know, light ups, then is it any different? And a Buddhist, if you've assumed that Buddhism is science, you can't oppose that. You have to accept that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's like there's two different ways potentially about the same outcome, which is to say, you know, either chemically or through the practices of Buddhism, meditation, right? You can exact this formulaic, this formula for happiness, or for detachment, or for, you know, whatever, like whatever the term.
Yeah,
is.
if there's a pill that makes you lose a sense of yourself, a pill that gives you enlightenment, a pill that makes you stop suffering or desiring, it's the same thing.
It's called LSD, and it is fantastic.
No, I was just about to say this episode is sponsored by Cipralex. You know, take your fucking daily anti-anxiety, and you know, life is good.
Yeah, well, I think it's such an interesting contradiction, because a traditional Buddhist would absolutely oppose that idea. But if even the Dalai Lama is saying, look, Buddhism is science, bro, then there's really no kind of way you can approach disagreeing with that if you've already accepted the premise.
Excellent point.
Yeah,
Excellent point.
But before we make it seem so ridiculous, I mean, a lot of our parents' generation in the late 60s and 70s did have what they perceived as, you know, exotic religious experiences brought on by mushrooms and especially acid. And there is a kind of funny link there, I think, with the feeling of spirituality, and also with the link between psychedelics and Silicon Valley. And maybe that can bring us into our discussion of capitalism and Buddhism.
Okay, so I think that was a great transition into how we can understand Buddhism and capitalism via.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting through line from the hippie movement through to the beginnings of the tech boom, the internet, personal computing. As I'm sure almost everyone knows, Steve Jobs was a Buddhist, and you see generally in Silicon Valley a wide acceptance with some form of Buddhism or what's now
psychedelics.
termed and psychedelics, and what's now termed mindfulness.
Mindfulness,
which in some ways is a kind of euphemism for Buddhism.
Yeah.
Well, it's basically it's not having to be a Buddhist.
Yeah,
but
it's coffee.
Co-opting
It's coffee without coffee without caffeine.
Oh, definitely.
Exactly. It's Buddhism with it's diet. Buddhism light, and it's because it's the part of it that can be absorbed by the hegemonic ideology, which is capitalism.
Did you say Buddhism light or Buddhism white? Because I think they both apply.
I would say Buddhism light, but yeah, exactly. It's rare that you see a Tibetan CEO. You know what I'm saying? But
more Tibetan CEOs.
Yeah,
I want some more representation.
I want some more Tibetans at the table. Okay, is all I'm saying. But I don't think it's a motherfucking coincidence that the arc of neoliberalism, the arc of basically making everything technological, and the rise of psychedelics, spiritualism, Buddhism in the West has a lot to do with the aging of the boomers. And
definitely, yeah.
And I just think that, I'm sorry if they're listening, but our parents' generation, the whole turncoating of the hippie movement, especially into the 70s and into the 80s, was to bring with them the quasi-spirituality that was born out of the 60s and to ruthlessly exploit and take advantage of the capitalist society and nature while still hanging on to these
Silicon Valley is the dream of the hippies, right? It's you go off on the land and you found your own kind of utopia, and this is what that has wrought. It kind of brings out to be a bit unfair, the utter inadequacy of the hippie image of changing the world. But
that's the thing. Is it for me, the pop culture absorption of Buddhism is to basically say, well, we cannot fundamentally change the structures that be, but we can change our attitude to them.
Fuck yeah,
and
great way of putting it.
And that's why it's not Buddhism.
Perfect.
It's Buddhism light. It's that we have already reaped the benefits of the neoliberal structure. We can't change it, but now we're going to propagate en masse the practices of detachment and enlightenment and sentimentality and fucking compassion. Fuck off.
Yeah,
you know
fuck
what
off
I mean?
with your compassion, Bill Gates. We don't need your fucking compassion.
The structures are the way. Exactly. It's fundamental change is now apparently impossible. History is over, right? If we're at the end of history, might as well change our attitude as opposed to, it's we're post-ideology, we're post-history, just be a little more compassionate, meditate twice a day, and let Wall Street make your money for you.
And it gives you the perfect, if you are the person who's ruthlessly exploiting your workers and the market, you get the perfect way to wash your hands of any responsibility. Oh, this is an illusion. It's the flow phenomena. I am merely just I am like the enlightened master with his sword, just kind of cutting through the world, and you don't have to accept any responsibility.
Amazon.
Yeah,
it's like working in an Amazon what's the word I'm thinking of?
Warehouse.
Warehouse, right? Ooh, warehouse, right? That's just your karmic, station in this life, and it's something that it's just suffering.
It's the caste you were born into.
And quite frankly, our situations are not any different from one another. We're fundamentally the same. But I'm also
you don't like your conditions in the Amazon fulfillment center. You don't like how 20,000 people have gotten coronavirus. That's a suffering, man. Suffering is an illusion. The only reason that you're suffering is because of your desire.
Right.
Yeah, there's a magazine called Mindful, and on their website, the flagship article I clicked on while preparing for this episode. I just want to read the first few sentences because I think that it's perfect to describe what we're getting at here. Mindfulness is the basic human ability to be fully present, aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around us. It's like, yeah, say that to the person working in the Amazon factory. It's like, hey, don't get overwhelmed here. This don't react to it. This is you have to be more present. You have to appreciate the present moment and not pay any mind to the system that's oppressing you, to any kind of possible solutions or other worlds, alternative solutions. Yeah.
Well, the alternative
Buddhism, there is no alternative.
Well, this is why, can I just say back to, before we go fully into this conversation about capitalism, when you were describing that, like, reason, and which is another problem of translation, basically the thinking of enlightenment in terms of the Western tradition. And, the thought that's born out of the Enlightenment is deemed as confusion, right? That it's translated as confusion. And it's like, like, my inferment there is that to engage in philosophy is basically to engage fundamentally with confusion, right? Is to, like, dive headlong into confusion.
Jake, when I was a Buddhist, I actually thought there was no point in philosophy because every form of philosophy was confusion and over intellectualization.
Well, and this is a classic sort of Jake and so on moment, but like to blow this thing, to really embellish this, it's like the very condition, like I think the ontic condition of late capitalism is like nothing but pure confusion. And the answer that capitalism is giving to us is either Cipralex, an antidepressant, anti-anxiety, or mindful, what is the magazine called? Mindful, just subscribe to Mindful and meditate more and download the new meditation app.
The same thing in some sense.
That meditation app, one of them is called 10% Happier, which I can't believe that that's what it's called. But
what about 11%?
My like, I don't know. This is why this is like my everyday experience is actually, for the most part, I'm tearing with like some anxiety. I think that life can be quite anxiety producing. The pressures of the economy, to have to work, to maintain a living, like my living arrangement, the constant buzzing of my phone, anyway, life is actually quite confusing. And I just think the problem of subjectivity is something that I've always been, through the lens of philosophy, willing to engage with, come hell or fucking high water. And the sort of the Buddhist response, but also like the late capitalist response, which is watered down Buddhism or antidepressants, is a brilliant sort of solution to the fact that confusion is the fucking bottom line. It is the station of subjectivity. It is the situation, the human situation. And I just think that it's so back to the capitalism thing. It's like, it's so interesting that we're seeing in a nexus, especially in embodied best by Silicon Valley, but also embodied best by my boomer father. Sorry, Dad, but like, who made a bunch of money in the 80s and 90s, and then picked up meditation, and it's like it's so fucking disgusting.
And towards this point, I just want to fish out another quote from Zizek here, because I think it's very pertinent. But he says, this is in Disparities, or rather, it's in Disparities. He says, "Where is the fetish which enables you to pretend to accept reality the way it is? Western Buddhism is such a fetish. It enables you to fully participate in the frantic pace of the capitalist game while sustaining the perception that you are not really in it, that you are well aware of how worthless the spectacle is. What really matters to you is the peace of the inner self, to which you can always withdraw."
Bam. And what is that but Nietzsche's slave morality, right? Like, so the slave morality posits that this world, this experience is inauthentic and is not what life truly is, but the other world, the outside world, is where we kind of attain our actual, I don't know, peace of mind, happiness, enlightenment, heaven, whatever you want to call it. And an outcome, if it's not necessarily prescribed in Buddhism, but just to return maybe to an immanent critique for a second, but an outcome is a kind of downplaying, distancing from, let's say, experience, your life, the world, because it's an illusion.
Yeah, there's this propensity to just dismiss, social dynamics and an involvement in society itself with as just a mere game, the play of illusion.
If everything's materialism anyway, then there's nothing uniquely bad about capitalism or imperialism.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
yeah.
guys, this is once again back to the nexus of Silicon Valley and Buddhism. It's like in the wired brain, there is no self. It's there is only neuronal processes. It's the same, it's the same response. It's like this is all just sort of electricity in the piece of meat that's in your skull. There is no failure of desire. We can actually get outside of that. It's funny that Silicon Valley has a very similar response to this problem of subjectivity. It has the same response as Buddhism, right?
Yeah,
it's the
for sure.
it's the Nietzschean slave logic, the metaphysical turn par excellence. It's like accepting this realm as merely just sort of like what do we want to say?
Samsara, baby.
Samsara, a turning of the wheel of desire, But actually, just to that point, and I wanted to ask you guys this earlier, isn't on some level reincarnation the literalization of eternal recurrence? And like, how do we parse out the difference between the two?
Eternal recurrence is not
different.
reincarnation. They're completely different things.
It's about living this. It's about willing to act in a way in which that act would be repeated ad infinitum.
Right? But in the Buddhist edifice, it actually is ad infinitum. It's like it actually is a reincarnation. It's not a hypothetical or like a kind of thought experiment. You really do reincarnate, and your lot in that reincarnation, this is in simplified terms, of course, but your lot in whatever form you reincarnate as is the result of your previous actions in the world. Whereas in Nietzsche, eternal recurrence is an idea that is meant to give like complete significance to the present. And he's not actually saying everything will repeat. He's saying if it did repeat, would it make you lose your mind, or would it give you like a radical kind of celebration of the current moment? Right.
Which is why I think there's a difference between the Lacanian subject and the Buddhist subject, because there's potential for being like, well, isn't the Buddhist recognition of suffering and accepting that suffering and impermanence kind of like traversing the fantasy? But the difference is that Buddhism sort of assumes that and then stops and proposes an exit, whereas the Lacanian subject has to actually tarry with that, traverse the fantasy, sort of assume there is no big other, and then reassume the big other, which we can get back to later, maybe towards the end, because I still think there's.
I was gonna say we might want to start wrapping it up now because we're about an hour in, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of hits all the notes that we were trying to, bring out in this discussion of the kind of critiques of Buddhism on its own terms, perhaps some contradictions that, a non-Buddhist might understand in the religion, in the philosophy, and then the scientific component, the connecting of Buddhism and science, what that connection does for each side, and then finally how both of these kind of fall, at least in our present experience, under the sphere of capitalism as the kind of ideal condition of
Capitalism.